And just this idea of using high intensity actions like acceleration, max velocity running, deceleration, change of direction, and then looking at the postures, the patterns, and the physical underpinning qualities that make up those high intensity actions, to me just makes so much sense.
Connor Schoepp 2.0. Super excited for him to hop on the pod, talk all things return to play, his biggest case studies, philosophies, a recent business owner. Excited to dive into that as well. But before we hop in, thank you for joining and tell me something good that's going on in your life.
Yeah, thanks, man. Happy to be back here. Appreciate it. Man, just yeah, the whole launch of the new business has been really, really cool for me, man. It's spending my whole career in the team setting and then, stepping over to the private side of things, which I have very little experience in, especially owning my own business has been terrifying, but also super fulfilling and a cool thing for me, man, to kind of, you know, start that journey in my career. And yeah, it's been a really fun process so far.
Fantastic. So if you ever run into Connor, it is Shep. And I asked before this podcast and last podcast, because normally I ask guests how to say their last name if I'm confused. And I have my traumatizing story about how to say Zach Dakin's name, how I learned that. But I literally started out the podcast saying, "Welcome, Connor Shope, Shep, however you say it." And then I guess you didn't correct me. And I was like, "Oh man, I'm supposed to use my first podcast, like know how to say his last name." But um, so Connor is a little bit of a journeyman himself in his time kind of in the team setting, NFL, Power Five, mid-major, all that kind of good stuff. He was on episode 150. If you guys want to check that out, this will be 184. So a very elite group of guests that have made it back for a 2.0. So if you want to hear more of those stories, I'll name drop kind of Vern Gambetta. He made the cut for your episode. Ed Reed made the cut as well. But now we're going to dive into things a little bit more specific, kind of RTP. But before we do that, could you take us through a little bit of that kind of thought process and kind of what has led you to making kind of rebuild your business?
Yeah, so I had spent the last decade or so working in the team setting, and I had a really wild journey, right? You can go back to the last episode and kind of hear that path, but I just kind of bounced around all over the country, right? I worked in pretty much every environment there is, from pro to Power Five football to mid-major Olympic side, um, and just one of the things I always found an interest in was the return to play side of things. Particularly when you work in football, you generally get siloed into, one kind of role within the department, right? You're either doing sports science or you're doing return to play, nutrition, whatever it is, right? And just for me, I always just kind of gravitated towards working with the injured athletes. And when I'd gotten to my last stop, I really started to dive into that, right? Like it really become a huge passion for me. And I just found so much joy in like getting to work with athletes one on one, helping bridge the gap between, that initial injury and getting them back out on the field. And it just kind of got to the point where I realized like that's ultimately what I wanted to do with my career. Um, and it happened a lot sooner than I ever thought it would. It's just kind of one of those things I was like, oh, like when I get out of the team setting, I'll just go start reconditioning athletes. But it just kind of came to a crossroad in my life where it was just like, why wait if that's what I really want to do with my life? So yeah, that led us to about 4 months ago now, moving up to Pittsburgh, to start rebuild performance and rehab.
Fantastic. So, return to play is something that I've definitely grown fond of over the last kind of few years. As I think that, the reason I can get athletes back to performance or I can do decent return to play is because I know what performance is, and arguably like good return to play is just really regress training. But a topic that I think is super interesting and definitely requires a lot of creativity and a lot of like fact finding and things like that. So I think it just gets a different part of a coach's brain going. So we've had some of these chats kind of in passing over the last few years or however long I've known you. So I'm super excited to record it. So first, brought to you by 1080 Motion. Really like the people over at that company. Really good products as well. I've been fortunate to have worked with the 1080 Sprint over the last few years. What are your general kind of non-negotiables, philosophy, background, do's, don'ts, people you'd give some shout outs to for return to play. And I know that that's super kind of vague, but kind of just to set a background of your lens and your biases or kind of just where you're coming from before we kind of dive into our top three kind of return to play case studies.
Yeah, so I would say like in terms of non-negotiables in return to play, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just having a performance mindset, right? Like I think working in the rehab setting is unique in the sense that like so much of or I think what the field is learned or driven by when it comes to return to play is just from like general populations and general health. And I think that working with athletes and actually getting them back out onto the field from injury is just so drastically different from that. And while it may seem super simple, I just think looking through the lens of performance as opposed to traditional medicine, maybe for return to play, I think it opens up a lot of other doors that I think is a lot more appropriate, right? So, and then in terms of things that are like super important to me that are, when it comes to return to play process, I'll just say number one and kind of my guiding principle is just master movement. And one of the things I don't think we maybe do a good enough job of in the field of accounting for, especially on the return to play side of things. I think so many of these injuries that I see once I kind of start to peel back the layers on them are derived from either poor movement or certain movement strategies that kind of compound over time. And so for me, that's just been, starting there and building out a foundation of movement before progressing to anything else has just been a huge, key factor in kind of the way that I go about doing things. From there, I would say using intensity as the primary driver, right? Like, I think if we look at sports and like actually working with an athlete back from injury, being able to reverse engineer like specifically like high intensity actions has been super valuable for me, right? And that's something I took from Alan Murdoch. And Alan Murdoch is he owns Elevate Speed and Rehab in England. And I've been following him for years. He posts a lot of great stuff out there, does a lot of really cool things. And just this idea of using high intensity actions like acceleration, max velocity running, deceleration, change of direction, and then looking at the postures, the patterns, and the physical underpinning qualities that make up those high intensity actions, um, to me just makes so much sense, right? Like it only makes sense to me to use the most intense sporting actions as the primary driver of getting these athletes back onto the field and using that as a filter to recondition them and prepare them to get back out onto the field. Outside of that, I'll say return to loading as soon as possible. That's something I'm a big believer in. The longer I've worked in return to play, the more and more true I find that to be, right? And that's not necessarily rushing athletes back to just, you know, doing things that are maybe unappropriate or things that they're not ready for. But it just kind of this concept of early optimal loading, right? And just getting them back to some sort of load. Like we get this mechanical transduction effect, and really it's just a fancy way of saying like we mitigate some of these, negative responses to injury, like detraining, autogenic muscle inhibition, guarding, fascicle shortening, right? So just by being progressive and being proactive in the loading process following injury, I think is a huge key for me. And then the last one, and I'll talk about this a little bit more once we get into one of our case studies specifically, but one of the huge kind of aha moments for me in my career and the way that I look at injuries is just understanding that all injuries are brain injuries, right? And so for me, that could be sensory motor function, kinesiophobia. That could be, even, neural drive, spatial awareness, whatever it is. All injuries are going to impact the brain in a certain way. And being able to account for that, I think was a really eye-opening experience for me and kind of as I've navigated this, return to play side of things in my career.
Fantastic. But just to also echo the intensity piece, that's from Boo Schexnayder. It was a big light bulb. I was hearing him speak on a podcast, and he was like, "If our rehab is just like two fly tens, that's it. It's like I'm not trying to get you really good at running at 70% and doing a bunch of reps, you know." And then Derek Hansen's return to play stuff with the sprint based, hamstring return to play protocol just like regressing, progressing drills. Find the hardest drill that you can do, feel a little tug in your hammy, hang out there for a little bit, and then you're done. And then you hit that every day, and then he'll get guys back in like 10 days, you know? So I think people that do really good performance also do good return to play, but intensity, because it's often where these injuries happen, you know? Instead of just like jogging around a field for 3 hours, it's when you sprint one too many times, you know, kind of all out and whatnot. But no, so I think a really well-rounded list of five, you know, that the listener should go back and maybe take a few notes on, but that sets the stage great for us to hop in. But that was our first question brought by 1080 Motion, and first, so I asked Connor to think of three of his kind of favorite case studies for return to play to keep this like anecdotal, very real life, you know, explain some nuance and some context. And we will get into the top three. So what is the first one? When I sent you this voice memo asking you to hop on the pod. Fit is an online programming software that helps you train more athletes in less time with greater individualization. For in-person or remote training, Fit does so with a streamlined programming process, decision-making trees to help you integrate data into your programming, as well as better communication with all pieces of a high-performance model involved to break down silos. Learn more at fit.io, that's fytt.io, and tell them that Matt Tometz sent you.
Yeah, so I'll say the first one that came to mind instantly, just because it was one of those ones that like really smacked me in the face early on in my career. It was a cool scenario, right? So I got to work with this athlete that actually wasn't necessarily one of mine in the team setting. Um, I kind of been reached out to work with him, and this kid was super athletic, like super hooked up, super fast, super high level athletes. And but he just had chronic lower limb issues, right? And so what I mean by that is like foot, ankle, calf, Achilles, just like kind of periodically throughout his whole career, uh, just had all these little things that continued to pop up, right? So I started working with him for a period of time, and he had great mobility, strong as all hell. Um, and so we start to like get into a little bit more of the movement stuff, and we're not getting a whole lot better at anything. Things aren't really progressing maybe the way that like traditionally the way that I do things I would like to see. And I'm just like racking my brain. And like one of the things that I did pick up early on was just watching this guy run. He was just so overly plantar flexed in everything that he did,
Mm.
right? And just like, if you
Very
understand
toesy,
performance,
toesy runner.
yeah, very toe, exactly how I describe it. Very toey runner. Um, and just one of the things I'm just a really strong believer in, like how you interact with the ground is going to dictate so much how you go about movement and the rest of your body operates. Um, and it just, yeah, just this kid was just super toey. And we did all these drills. We did the pogos with the flexed ankles. We did the running drills and regressed and progressed and built up. And he just, when it came to actually like sprinting and high intensity movement, he would just revert right back. Right. And then finally, like one day, I just kind of got like fed up working with him. And I just asked him, like, dude,
You're
like, why
done.
do you run like
You're
that?
done.
Yeah, well, like, yeah. I was just like, man, like, why do you run like that? What are you not getting from me? Like when I'm telling you like that this is causing an issue, and he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, dude, you just run on your toes. And he's like, oh, like, well, my dad, he's trained me my whole life. That's how he told me to run,
Oh my
right?
gosh.
Yeah, he's like, my dad's been training me since I was 6, and he told me, good athletes run on their toes, right? And it was just like this like huge aha moment of just like once you start to peel back the layers and like look at some of these things, like one, I should ask that question on the first day, but two, like how much some of these movements compound over time and can affect these athletes and how important that is just I can't put enough emphasis on how important that is.
It's funny you mentioned that. I remember when I was first getting into NFL combine training at TC Boost, and that was one of those things that I'd always heard of as an intern, as a part-time coach over a few summers, because I would come back for winter break to train for baseball, and then I'd go back to school by the time that those guys would start. It was my first one, and we had our staff meeting to kind of plan it all, and and talk about like do's, don'ts, and Tommy, the head guy's going to lead it, and we're all supporting him and how to do that and whatnot. And a big thing we talked about was like not giving conflicting cues. And basically, Tommy's going to lead that. And then if you see something, go talk to Tommy on the side and make sure that like, as coaches, also what we choose not to say matters, right? So it's like I could see one thing and that could be right, but what he's choosing to attack first is like, more important or things like that. And there was an athlete that pulled his hammy. It was a few weeks, this was like years before me. So my boss was telling me the story. He saw a video on Instagram over the weekend and they were talking about pawing the ground. So then he started to think about like reaching his foot and pulling back, and then he like pulled his hammy in combat training. So like the influences that these athletes get, you just have no idea. But just a funny story. So I guess my next question is, as you were kind of describing the background of that story, what jumped out to me was this like pattern of kind of lower limb injuries,
Mhm.
and there's the acute kind of weird one-off, injuries that just happen. Like sports are hard, right? So when something is a little bit more chronic or a little bit more pattern related, what is your kind of thought process when you're doing your kind of intake to address like a one-off kind of hammy pull versus more like a chronic thing, kind of like that? Coaches, this podcast is sponsored by Samson Equipment. They've been providing elite strength training equipment and professional weight room solutions since 1976. If you value quality products, great customer service, and a company with integrity, then make Samson Equipment your go-to. Visit them at samsonequipment.com. That's SAMSON Equipment, and let them know that Matt Tometz sent you. ISOFIT is not just pioneering isometric strength training, but they are opening up a brand new world of possibilities with health and performance benefits through isometric training and their own groundbreaking product. With patented force matching technology, they're reshaping the boundaries of functional health and human performance. Discover the future of health, fitness, and sports performance at isofit.com. That's ISOPHIT.com, and tell them that Matt Tillman sent you.
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of things, right? Like where I think we conflate some of these injuries is that we think that they're ever singular in nature, right? Like oh, like this happened because of X, when the reality is like all injuries are multifactorial in nature and there's all these different things coming together at the same time. I think just going back to the movement strategy piece, like that's the one for me where I think like using those four high intensity actions and being able to like reverse engineer those and like what good postures, patterns, and like physical underpinning qualities look like in those. And then just using those is like almost like, right, like testing is training, training is testing. Um, Identifying like, okay, like, is there anything from this standpoint? Because that's where I see like where a lot of these like chronic injuries are coming from. Like, because there are a lot of one-off cases where like traditional rehab works and they're fine and everything's all good and dandy. But where I see these athletes that do continue to struggle with similar uh, injury patterns over time is that oftentimes it is a movement strategy, right? So what like there's this paper that came out, James Wild in
Hmm.
2022, linking acceleration strategies and injury sites. And it basically breaks athletes up into quadrants of their specific acceleration strategy between um, contact dominant versus air dominant, or I should say stride length versus stride frequency, short ground contact time versus long ground contact time. And it basically just archetyped these athletes into bounders, striders, bouncers, and spinners. Um, and what were able to identify was like that each of these archetypes uh, gravitated towards these specific injuries. Right. And so I think we need to do a lot more looking into that field. I really think can show us a lot about why maybe some of these things are happening.
Yeah, it's a super interesting study. I heard that one first referenced by Stu McMillan. And for those maybe not as familiar, for example, a short ground contact time and a short stride length would be like a spinner. So they kind of just have their wheels going, but they're not really going anywhere versus someone who would be a bounder. They're on the ground a long time, but then they're also covering a lot of ground. So just to rethink on like what is the pattern of them hitting the ground, and believe it or not, the ground is undefeated, and it's pretty forceful if you make it so. So just to have this idea of like what are they chronically exposed to, even if it's just how they do their things healthily, you know? And to think that even a 10-yard excel, there's four ways to do it, and that's just two variables of like stride length and ground contact time. So just taking a step back and into asking those questions as uh as specific as it could be, breaking down some variables and bucketing athletes, or as general as, hey, dummy, why don't you get it yet?
Mhm.
Kind of all questions are on the table. So a very cool and insightful kind of first one. So I guess next, what is your second kind of biggest return to play case study to drop some bombs on us?
Yeah. So I'll say I was working with this one of my athletes this time and coming back from a knee injury, and surgical intervention, coming back and just had a lot. By the time I was able to start actually working on the affected limb, um, ton of atrophy, right? And supposedly he had been working with the PT and the ATs and doing all these things. And, um, by the time they got handed off to me, there was a ton of atrophy, right? And so for me, the one nice thing about working in rehab, like it is very linear in nature, right? Like if you don't have range of motion or in that specific scenario, if you don't have, you know, the tissue capacity, right? Like start there. Like that's the true low hanging fruit, right? And so in my mind, like, all right, like cool. We'll start there. We'll start attacking that. We'll track quad size, strength, and boom, we'll be back here in a couple weeks, right? And so I go through all the traditional things of squats, lunges, sled drags. I'm hitting all the hypertrophy stuff. I'm hitting mechanical tension, muscle damage, metabolic stress, right? Like I'm checking all the boxes in my mind that should be fixing this issue, right? And just like over a series of probably 5 to 6 weeks, we really just weren't seeing any changes, right? Which has been weird for me because like historically, when I work with these scenarios, like if you get an athlete on a good loading protocol, like these things tend to actually revert back pretty quickly, right? Like they've obviously atrophied because of the surgical intervention and the amount of detraining that they've gone into, but usually they pop back pretty quick.
Yeah, it's easier to get muscle back than get it the first time.
Yeah, exactly, right. And this was a well-trained athlete, super strong, genetically a super muscular kid, and it just wasn't coming back, right? And so I just started to like it became very clear to me that there was like a motor control and autogenic muscle inhibition issue, right? Like that connection just between his brain and the quad just wasn't working the right way. Um, and so I just took a step back and this was kind of at the time in my career where I really started to look into some of the brain function stuff and how those things work and the efferents and afferent responses, um, and what actually happens during some of these inhibitions. And so I just kind of like started from ground zero and just started to do everything through the lens of like, okay, how can I start to repair this issue? Right. So we're like started just really focusing on like proprioception, right? Like getting him out of his shoes onto different surfaces, starting to restore some of that like sensory information response between his foot and the ground. Started really focus on just like spatial awareness and his ability to just control his limb through space, neural drive, and just his ability to like focus on activating that quad, motor control, and anything, just like more than anything, just like restoring his confidence in moving that, and using his quad muscle. And over the next 2 weeks, that thing blew up faster than like anything I'd ever done. Right. And we weren't doing anything crazy, right? Like we were doing a lot of tempo training. We were using a metronome a lot. We were using a lot of EMS on pretty much everything that we did. Um, but it was just crazy to me that like we made more progress in 2 weeks than we had in those first like 5 to 6 weeks. And it was just kind of crazy to see of like, oh wow, like the brain really does govern everything. Like, right. Like we all say that like the nervous system is king. But it's a whole nother thing when you kind of see it happen like in front of your eyes.
So three things on that. So first, having a more well-rounded approach and taking a step back. When at first when you said that the leg wasn't really responding or kind of putting on some muscle, my first thought was like, was he even eating enough or getting protein in? And I
Mm,
think it's interesting to look at it from a super well-rounded perspective where in some of the like tendon kind of rehab stuff, you have to get your vitamin C in. Um, and your collagen. So it's like take your collagen plus like some orange juice and stuff. And I'm not in
Mhm.
nutrition. I'm not in that space. I just know that like that's a big piece to rehabbing tendons and stuff. Then second is simply just asking athletes whether it's something as simple as like, why do you run like that? Like, where do you feel this? You know, and it's just like athletes when they do an exercise and they're like, oh, coach, this exercise is so easy. And it's like, well, you're not doing it right. And then they start to actually
Mhm.
feel it in the target muscle. They're like, oh my gosh, this exercise is so hard. So I guess like, was he getting like stimulation and burn and kind of feel in the quad? Or when you started doing all of that stuff, was it like a big kind of wake up to the muscle? So was it that it was getting the muscular stimulation, but not the brain, or the brain wasn't letting the muscle kind of get that stimulus, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I would say it's probably a little bit of both, right? So it's a cop-out answer, but
Oh,
it,
it depends.
right, it depends, right? But I think it was more so than anything just the brain's response, right? Because like the athlete would say like, "Oh, this is burning," like he was trying, like that was never like a question. It was just so obvious that he was having to compensate with like everything that he could to get that thing to work, right? Like he'd be sitting in a leg extension and he'd contort his body and he'd start
Oh
pulling
yeah.
handles and like he'd be leaning back and like, yeah, he would get it, but it was very obvious the quad wasn't driving the ship, right? Or like we'd be doing reverse sled drags and we'd get 20 yards down the turf and he was 8 yards to the left compared to
Uh,
where he had started at, right? And like it was hard and he's like, yeah, I can feel it in my quad, but it was just so obvious that there was something missing there, right? And to be honest, like bad on me. I probably should have caught that way earlier.
you live and learn, and here we are now. But so last question on that. Another question. If someone wanted to start with this more kind of like ground up literally or neuro up approach, walking on some of those like little rock mats or basically sensory integration, like where does someone start if they've determined whether it's like for an arm injury, like do you start on the hand, leg injury, do you start on the feet, like to go a more neuro kind of sensory approach, where do practitioners start with their athlete?
Yeah, so I think one for me is just restoring sensation and like neural drive, right? So just like the idea of exposing athletes to really simple things like spike balls for the hands, getting athletes out of their shoes and onto different surfaces. Like, if you ever look, I forget the name of the picture, but there's like this picture where the body's proportional to the amount of
Oh yeah, yeah.
proprioceptors in the body, and it's basically you have a giant nose, you have giant eyes, giant ears, giant hands, and giant feet, right? And basically, like our body and it makes these decisions and moves in a certain way based off the information that it's perceiving from the environment around it from those proprioceptors, right? So just by like restoring, I think that kind of information feedback loop with just simple things like, you know, walking on a rock mat or, getting out of the shoes, playing with a spike ball, whatever it is, like I think there's just so much low hanging fruit there. Outside of that, things that I've had success with, I think EMS is a tool that, especially even on the performance side, isn't utilized nearly enough. And we're starting to see a lot of people start to integrate that. But it's one of those things that, like, we've yet to find any research out there that shows any sort of point of diminishing returns with EMS, right? And I just with me, I think it's just so impactful. It's so valuable both actively and passively. Next, I would say is just tempo training. And specifically, one thing that I've gotten super interested in is the use of a metronome in tempo training,
Hmm.
and just your ability. So I don't know if you're familiar with that, but basically just the concept of like being able to maintain rhythm is a is a neural factor, right? And specifically being able to maintain movement with a metronome, right? And being able to create that connection between the brain and the body and our ability to perceive sound and movement and all these different things. There's a lot of really, really good research out there, not just on the performance side of things, but even on like the neural disability issue side of things of like being able to repair some of these serious traumatic brain injuries with simply using a metronome and performing just general activities. Um, yeah, just a few things that I've had a lot of success with that I've really, really enjoyed.
Rhythm is not one of the things that your boy was blessed with. There's a reason I walked on D2 and now I coach. But no, I think rhythm, if there's anything that I've learned from like working with literally 10-year-olds up to pros is like the ones that can do things on rhythm, off rhythm, like whether it's like dribbling a basketball or decelerating for a cut, um, just to do anything kind of. I'm trying to figure out a different word besides rhythmically because I'm using the same word, but and I know that if you listen to a metronome while you're running, then your stride rate will match up with that metronome. So for return to play, is it like a metronome in their ears when they're doing sled dragging, or is it like like quasi eccentric, like 40-second like squats or stuff, or like where would that actually come into the actual program for using a metronome with your RTP athletes?
Yeah, so I'd say like what they found is that you can actually pretty much do it with anything and you're going to start to see benefits. Where I particularly use it is just really anytime we're doing any sort of tempo training, which in the rehab setting, especially early on in the early phases, is going to be pretty much the whole time. So we'll just take like a leg extension, for example, and like one of the things like, you know, something I'll take all my ACL athletes through now is like a neural leg extension phase where we're doing it's a 3 to 4 week block of all right, it's a 6 second eccentric, or we'll say, yeah, eccentric, 6 second isometric, 6 seconds in concentric,
Oh,
right?
ouch.
Yeah. And that's just one rep. And then the next week it's 5, 5, 5. Next week 4, 4, 4. Next week 3, 3, 3. But just the idea is the load is pretty irrelevant. Like it's going to suck no matter what. The point is that your ability to control it on tempo through that range of motion, and pairing that with the metronome, um, has a huge effect on, the neural drive aspect and your ability to activate the quad. And so things like that. I've even done it with, training when I was, training freshman college athletes, and we were going through our block zero stuff of, all right, hey, hands out, body weight squat on me, 5 count down, 5 count at the bottom, 5 count up. But just pairing that with the metronome, yeah, really anytime we're under any sort of tempo training.
Fantastic. So the first case study was the value of asking kind of good questions, no matter how simple they may be. The second one was the importance and light bulb of kind of the sensory integration for return to play. So I'm excited. I'm excited for the third one. What do you have cooked up for us? Your third case study.
Yeah, so this one I had. For those that don't know, I spent the last 3 years as the director of sports science at Liberty University, applied sport performance, fancy way to say sports science. And during that time, one of the things I'd really gotten into is the force plate aspect and kind of building out that protocol and how we were going to use that moving forward. Um, because it wasn't something I had been previously exposed to it, but I hadn't really led the charge on anything related to that. And so I got really into that. One of the things that I was really into, um, particularly on the return to play side of things, was asymmetry. And I was working with this athlete, and basically part of my job was just monitoring all of our athletes, right? Every athlete was required to jump once a week. Uh, I would go back through, look at their data, try to identify if there's any huge red flags that we need to, drive any conversations that we need to have with sports medicine, with the performance coach, so on and so forth. And we had this athlete flag for, I think it was a 37% left and right asymmetry during the braking phase of their counter movement jump. Right, so braking phase, for those that don't know, is just the eccentric loading portion of the counter movement jump. Which is very indicative of, loading strategies and eccentric strength and a lot of things that drive, just general health and performance, right? And so immediately red flagged. And so I started working with this athlete, trying to identify like, okay, like what was the issue here? They had some injury history in the affected limb that was driving that in my mind was driving these issues, right? So for me, I just started them back like, all right, we just went back to a lot of block zero training. We repatterned everything, her squat, her landings, how she jumped, yada yada yada. And man, it's just nothing was working. All right, and you can kind of find a theme here of like, uh, I get to this point and just things just aren't working the way that I want them to, or traditionally the way that I thought they would, right? We were focusing on single leg loading and doing all these things. And then finally, like I came across this research by a guy by the name of Chris Bishop. And anybody out there that hasn't heard of Chris, Chris is a brilliant researcher, especially on asymmetries and using force plates. And he's the one that if you've ever seen the graphic of like the stoplight of anything greater than 15% red flag, 10 to 15 yellow, 0 to 10 good to go, green, right? And so I started looking at some of his stuff, and some of the stuff that he'd found was that athletes can present with a serious discrepancy on a bilateral jump, but if we take them to a unilateral jump or a single leg jump, they can be completely fine,
Oh,
right? So, after about 4 weeks, I had this bright idea of like, oh, maybe I should test each individual leg like I should have from the beginning. And come to find out, she was actually perfectly symmetrical, right? And so my mind, like I'm going crazy, like, well, why? Right. So then like a couple things like, okay, like maybe it was a pattern she picked up from the injury that she previously had. Um, Maybe it was a just a output issue, right? Which actually turns out it wasn't, right? Because we measured both pretty the exact same. And then my next thought was like, well, maybe it's a physical limitation. And so I took her through a pretty extensive movement screen and identified one, she basically had no dorsiflexion in that leg that was affected. And then two, she also presented with a pretty significant leg length discrepancy,
oh.
right? And so just like kind of this idea of like, and a theme of all these case studies here is like one, always continue to ask why. Two, um, you can't coach somebody out of physical limitations, right? Like you can't get somebody to do something that they just don't have the physical qualities to execute, right? And so just like for me, using that as like a reminder, like for the rest of my career, just like understanding like, okay, like make sure we check the rest of these boxes before we start to make, these conclusions about why things are happening.
Yeah, I think that that's a great example of when you feel something's off, like trust your gut and then like ask more questions. And the story that I have for that is it was this high school receiver that came in for a hamstring, and I worked with him in the past. Um, and and he had got basically kind of landed on. So it wasn't like a sprinting hamstring, but we went through all of our Derek Hansen return to play stuff. We got up to some pretty solid drills like straight leg bounding and resisted runs, but he just kept having this kind of like sensation or this feeling, and it was a little bit more intense than kind of the tug that we were looking for. And it was about at that like 4 week mark. And I was like, I don't know if I'm doing something wrong, but like Derek gets these guys back in like 10 days and it's been like 4 weeks and we've made it through everything, but like something's just not lining up. And I'm definitely not one like I'm so bad at selling, especially now as a business guy. But I went up to the dad and I was like, I'm not trying to spend your money, but like something's not right here. Like maybe go get it checked out, but this is just something that I don't know what it is. And then long story short, when he got landed on, his hamstring broke off a little piece of his hip bone, you know?
Mm,
And it's just like, I just knew it wasn't a regular hamstring. First the mechanism of injury, but second, just like as we were going through all these drills, I was like, something's not right. So I think definitely just to trust your gut. And sometimes like if you can get the easy gains doing the basic things, then like start there, obviously, but as soon as something's not right, I'd say you're probably more often right than wrong with that stuff. Um, so I guess I want to ask about kind of force plates. Is there anything else that you look at besides asymmetries? What are your kind of favorite metrics? Or if someone had force plates in this kind of return to play setting, if I had to ask like a question 3B to this that we made up as we went, what else do you look at besides kind of asymmetries to send the
yeah. So
listener on a rabbit hole?
yeah, no, no, no. I love this, man. It's I really got big into the force plate side of things when I was in that last role, and it was really fun for me. So yeah, for me, this is something I stole from Drake Berbert over at Hawk, and it's just the idea of ODS outputs, drivers, and strategies, right? So just outputs being, your jump heights, your peak relative propulsive powers, MRSI, right? So I would say those would probably be the big three for me from an output standpoint, right? Like what is the output that that athlete's capable of? From a driver standpoint, that's for me tells like, okay, how is this athlete getting to those outputs, right? And so asymmetry is a huge part of that. Specifically, left and right average relative braking force was what I primarily looked at. Other things that I look at is impulse, I think is a big driver for just performance in general, right? So just that area under the curve. And then just looking at it from a triphasic standpoint of, okay, during the braking phase, during the propulsive phase, and then looking at it as a whole, right? Is this an athlete that, because you could have two athletes that get to the same output, jump height, we'll say, um, but one may be extremely concentrically driven, propulsively driven, we'll say. One may be extremely eccentrically biased, right? Where was this athlete before, right? Are they back to that same jump height, but they're favoring one side of the curve than others? Are they getting there with force? Are they getting there with speed? So on and so forth, right? And then the last one is just being strategy, right? And so for me, things that I look at with that is time to take off. So how long are they taking to execute that jump? Counter movement depth and the return to play side of things, I think is a really, really important one. Of just being able to monitor their strategy, right? Like inherently, if I take longer and I just go lower, I can probably jump higher, right? And then last one is just the braking phase specifically, right? I just think, I haven't seen anything. This is pretty anecdotal, but one thing that we do know, like pretty well on the return to play side of things, is that the first thing and probably the most important thing to go following injury is your ability to eccentrically load. And so being able to restore that, not just from a force standpoint, but also from a time of execution standpoint, I think is huge.
Yeah, I think a lot of good nuggets in there to have a general kind of framework, whether it's like the ODS or I have my like five metric. You have your eccentric and concentric metrics, so there's a ratio, and then you have your general kind of output metrics that everyone kind of understands, and then you have some sort of ratio of like what they put into it versus what they get out of it, kind of like an MRSI, and then just to see where they are lacking or what they do really well, it kind of all makes sense. But then also diving into as simple as like I love making correlation matrices in Excel. It's so easy and it looks so good, but it's like shocker, like counter movement depth and like time to take off is correlated. So like last year, it's like, oh, their time to take off is slower. It's like, well, yeah, they're dipping lower and they're jumping higher. So like it's not worse, it's just different, you know? Unless I were to always coach them to jump as fast as possible. But I guess next, talk about like impulse and stuff. And Mike Young a few episodes ago, I used to be able to rattle off these episode numbers uh like it was nothing. But Mike Young was talking about how time to peak eccentric force or time to insert any of the metrics that you or I previously just dropped. Um, was a big light bulb for him. And I think that that's the most unique thing about sports is the time constraint. Like powerlifters can finish a squat for 9 seconds and that's fine, but athletes are on the ground for like zero point 0.1 seconds, So I think looking at something with the time component, depending on how you cue the jump, obviously, and how the athlete actually performs it, um, but no, I think a nice little kind of framework for the listener to make their own kind of force play kind of rabbit holes. All right, so boom, there you have it. Three return to play case studies from the man himself, Connor Schoepp, not Schoepp. Learn from my mistakes. A very good friend. I'm very, very fortunate and grateful to be able to say that as well. So, for anyone who wants to learn more about rebuild or yourself or get in contact, what do you want to shamelessly plug? Emphasis on shameless to where the listeners can get more of you.
Yeah. So if you're in the greater Pittsburgh area, we'll be opening up our location soon in the Northeast area, Fox Chapel, Harmar Township. So excited about that. Anybody wants to reach out to me that I can help them, offer, consulting, rehab, whatever it is, return to play, continuing education. Reach out to me online at rebuild PR underscore. pretty much on all my socials. Get back to you real fast there, or contact me at my website, www.rebuildperformancerehab.com.
Fantastic. So those will all be in the show notes below. And thank you again for your time. And I'm looking forward to chatting next.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt.